Yeah, it's working. Okay, hello and welcome to this series of talks in conjunction with my photographic exhibition, Survival. It documents a specific site, Pipemakers Park, an urban nature reserve left to regenerate and overgrow. Plants coexist and thrive, attracting bird life in this regenerative garden surrounded by housing estates in the western suburbs. Survival is currently showing at Rubicon ARI until 9th of April. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that this forum is being broadcast from Naarm, Melbourne, on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Greater Kulin Nation, and we pay respects to elders past, present and emerging that may be listening in. This forum is an introductory discussion on urban ecology and the concept of terrain bay, so-called wastelands such as abandoned industrial sites, forgotten parklands and overgrown rail corridors. Join us as we integrate artistic and scientific discourse to unpick these networks with a particular focus on the spontaneous plants that inhabit these marginal spaces. I'd like to introduce Dean Schrieke to discuss this topic with us today. Hi, Dean.
Hello.
Hey. Dean is a PhD student in the Green Infrastructure Research Group at the University of Melbourne. Dean's PhD thesis focuses on the ecology and physiology of vegetation that colonises green roofs, known as spontaneous species. His research looks at how green roofs shape spontaneous communities, the implications of these communities for green roof functionality, and how we can better design green roofs to improve vegetation cover and diversity. Research papers include socio-ecological dimensions of spontaneous plants on green roofs, trait-based green roof plant selection, water use and drought response of 9 common spontaneous plants. I will be your host today. I'm Sarah Lynch, an artist currently based in Naarm, and I work primarily across digital and analogue photography, video and installation. My most recent work examines the diversity of the botanical world and the relationship between plants, people and ecosystems they inhabit. I recently completed my Master of Photography at RMIT in 2020. In 2021, I completed a residency at Bogon Centre for Sound Culture in between lockdowns. This is the second forum in a 2-part series. The other forum was with Dr. Prudence Gibson, titled Encounters with the Vegetal World, focusing on vegetal liveliness and critical plant studies. I will put up these recordings of these talks on my website. This project has been generously supported by the Victorian Government Sustaining Creative Workers Initiative in partnership with Creative Victoria and Regional Arts Victoria. I hope this forum creates some discussion and invites new perspectives on spontaneous plants in so-called wastelands and urban spaces left to overgrow. I'll hand it over to Dean now as he gives a presentation on his current research for his PhD. Welcome.
All right, thank you. Thanks. I'll just share my screen. Can you see that?
Yep.
So thanks, Sarah, for that introduction. And I guess a good place to begin this discussion is by outlining my research, because my research is focused on green roofs and not ground level ecosystems, but many of the principles that I deal with are also applicable to ground level ecosystems. So as Sarah mentioned, I conduct my research on green roofs, And these are systems that are designed to facilitate plant growth on rooftops. And they're kind of like big planter pots, but as you can see from this schematic here, they're actually really quite complicated engineered ecosystems. They have shallow and highly exposed, freely draining substrates, which actually makes them quite a tough place for plants to grow. And yet, despite these hostilities, we find a range of spontaneous or weedy species that colonize these landscapes. And this is particularly evident on unmanaged green roofs. And you might know these species as weeds, and you'd be about right because many of these species are your classic garden variety weeds that also appear in Sarah's photographic work. However, as scientists, we're kind of reluctant to use this terminology because it's very subjective, and it doesn't really have a clear definition. So instead, we refer to these species as spontaneous or synanthropic, and this highlights their persistence without and often in spite of human interference, and also alludes to their close evolutionary association with human behavior, so how we design and how we manage our landscapes. And so I'm interested in what this vegetation community can tell us about the green roof environment specifically, but also how these species influence the functionality of urban landscapes more broadly. And so in an applied sense, we can use this information to better design and manage our landscapes. And my PhD research focuses on the physiology of individual species, but also the ecology of their overall communities. I use a range of approaches, including glasshouse-based experiments, but also analyses of global data sets. And most of my work actually involves measuring what's referred to as plant functional traits and looking at how these are associated with environmental characteristics. And so a plant functional trait is essentially any feature of a plant that's measurable, and that potentially affects the growth and survivorship of in each environment. So as you can imagine, the range of these functional traits is pretty much infinite. So we have to be very careful when we choose which traits to use to monitor vegetation change in response to environmental change. I mainly use leaf traits in my work, and these are really quite commonly used because they have a very clear relationship with plant growth and survival. They're also really easy to measure, which is good. Um, when you take all of these different plant traits and combine them, you kind of get an overall evolutionary strategy. And there's a number of different frameworks that sort of simplify these strategies down. And so for my work, I mainly use what's called the plant economic spectrum, and that breaks these down into fast and slow species. So at the slow end of the spectrum, like this Opuntia cactus here with the walking stick, these are slow growing species that slowly acquire resources and conserve them. So these are usually really quite stress tolerant species. At the other end of the spectrum, you have fast growing species that quickly acquire and utilize resources, like this dandelion here. Um, the fast species are also kind of live fast and die young. As you can see, this dandelion's about to jump off this cliff here, whereas slow species usually grow to like a much older age. Now, these on green roofs, you actually find a diverse range of fast and slow species, and this kind of reflects the trait filtering effect of a green roof. So if you can imagine a green roof is the environment on a green roof is actually quite dynamic across seasons. So in summer there's a water deficit, so there's a drought conditions essentially, whereas in winter in Melbourne you'll have high water availability, and so this dynamism favors different uh, uh, functional trait syndromes over time. So in winter, it would favor perhaps faster growing species because there's more resources available to be exploited. Whereas in summer, those slow growing, more stress tolerant species are more adaptive because there's less resources available. Now I can talk more about how this relates to the urban environment later, but on a green roof, this is actually pretty cool, and it it sort of highlights how spontaneous species can be actually advantageous on a green roof. One of the primary functions of green roofs in Melbourne's CBD is to alleviate issues associated with stormwater and flooding. So in this sense, spontaneous species are ideal because you've got plant cover when there's drought on behalf of those slow species, and stormwater mitigation when there's high resource availability from those fast species that are using a lot of water. But we could talk about this a little bit more later. For now, I'll just pass back to Sarah, and you can get going on those very difficult questions for me.
Oh, thanks, Dean. It's really informative for layman's like me who don't understand this stuff. It gives me even just to understand some of the traits and fast and slow is good. What I'll just ask you some questions about the broader urban ecology. What is urban ecology if people haven't heard of the term? Could you give any history and background to it?
Sure. Urban ecology, it kind of emerged as a sub-discipline of ecology in the early 1970s. And this is due in part to the fact that we were developing a better understanding of the impact that humans were having on the planet. So that was becoming more well documented, alongside the increasing size of human settlements and the increasing density of human settlements were resulting in some serious environmental problems, which persist today, that threaten the health and well-being of both people living in cities and people living outside of cities. And so based on that, ecologists began to increasingly acknowledge that cities were legitimate subjects for ecological study. Now, Melbourne has its own unique history of urban ecology research. We had an Australian Research Centre for Urban Ecology, which was situated in the Royal Botanic Gardens, and that existed from around 1998 to 2016. I believe it ended due to lack of funding, which is unfortunate, but many of the ecologists from that group continue to conduct work in urban ecology, including in the Green Infrastructure Research Group that I'm a part of. In fact, my secondary supervisor, Professor Nick Williams, was a member of that ARC for urban ecology. And so urban ecology has kind of evolved into a unique field of study through the fact that it actually integrates several disciplines that investigate both the kind of ecological dynamics of cities, but also the human dimensions of urban ecosystems. And urban ecologists are usually involved in basic or fundamental research, which is more focused on understanding the structure and function of urban environments, or they can be engaged in applied or practical research that is focused on solving important environmental problems.
But I was thinking in Australia, though, we're a bit different to Europe where we don't study a lot of these sites, which is what I was about. The next question was about terrain vague, and if you could explain more what that encompasses and how it's maybe more studied over in Europe and America than in Australia.
Yeah, I think the the sort of fundamental difference is that um, cities are a relatively recent thing on this continent. Many of the species that I deal with and that you would be considered spontaneous vegetation in Australia have only been here since 1778,
Mm.
whereas most of these species are native to Europe, and so there's a different association association there. There's kind of a visceral distaste for these species in Australia, whereas in Europe they're kind of celebrated. Um, but yeah, so terrain varg itself is like a younger concept in Australia. I mean, it's a young concept generally because these spaces have only, from an ecological perspective, uh, become uh, valued as places to study relatively recently. But essentially, terrain.
For kind of in Berlin bomb sites and
Yeah. So
like that.
in Europe, the study of urban vegetation goes back hundreds of years. From early studies of vegetation communities on the Colosseum in Rome, and you can imagine that the
Oh,
Colosseum was really a place where you would find a wide array of species from um, like northern Africa, because of the amount of trade that was occurring through that region, um, and exotic animals that would come with seeds that were embedded in their fur, for example.
yeah.
So, these sorts of studies have occurred for a long, long time. And then, as you mentioned, the study of bomb sites
Mm.
after the Second World War, um, and that actually a lot of this study does come out of the Second World War, particularly in Berlin, where you had areas that sort of um, lost their functionality by the wall. Areas that were cut off, such as different like railway infrastructure, um, which became disused, and plants were allowed to colonize and to undergo succession and grow and change. Um, you don't really have that occurring in Australia.
Mm.
And indeed, in Melbourne, many of these spaces are aberrations. They're only there for a very short period of time before
Yeah.
um,
There's
before
so
they're
much
developed.
change,
Yeah,
development. There's
yeah,
not much time for them to be a place for 30 years or
exactly. And many of the really interesting things in these landscapes and the productivity and functionality of these landscapes increases over time and through succession. So,
mm.
you know, a, a lot of there's a lot of I guess um, concerns about, for example, monocultures. Or people will walk past a site that has recently been demolished, and there's just
Mm.
sonchus or one single spontaneous species just covering the entire site, and that's considered to be a really
Uh,
bad thing. But that's that is a very initial stage of succession and development of a vegetation community, and it's almost like a
sorry, can you
band-aid,
explain
you know.
succession a little more further? What that is
Yeah.
for people?
So, yeah, so succession is typically divided into two phases, which is primary and secondary succession, but it's the process by which the mix of species and habitat in an area change over time. So in primary succession, you have newly exposed or newly formed landscapes that are colonized for the first time, which is what I'm kind of describing with
Oh,
that,
okay.
field of Sonchus. Or you might see, like recently I saw um, an abandoned lot that was just covered in Malva parviflora. It's just this sea of a single species, which like I was describing, is kind of like a band-aid. It's the ecosystem is beginning the process of healing and changing. So yeah, in a city, it might be a newly demolished building site or a
Yeah.
recently cleared landscape. And so you find these kind of pioneer species, these early
Yeah.
colonizers. And they usually have a really short life cycle because they're dealing with disturbance. They're being mowed or they're being removed, or in a newly demolished site, the soil is highly alkaline because it's full of lime from concrete, for example.
Yeah.
Um, and these are your typical spontaneous species. These are your garden variety weeds that, we all know. Whereas in secondary succession, um, a place that's previously occupied with these species is disturbed and kind of recolonized, and these landscapes gradually become more complex in terms of their species diversity and also those functional traits that I talked about earlier. You'll get more diversity in those functional traits represented by the community.
Is that more
So
woody species, or they kind of have a bit more time to grow into bigger
yeah, and so you can get
growth?
exactly, you can get a better mix of those along that fast, slow spectrum, because initially you only really have fast species because they grow really quickly, they produce a lot of seed, they complete their life cycle, and then they can kind of survive the intervening periods through seed dormancy. Then they re-emerge when the conditions are right again for them. You can't really have slow growing species because they don't have an opportunity to actually uh, you know uh, produce seed or to flower because there's this constant disturbance for them. So you have these fast species that turn up initially, but then they kind of create the conditions where slower species can survive. And so one of these
Nitrogen enriching, or
yeah, so you can have nitrogen enrichment, like that's a pretty common one, especially on green roofs. So the substrate that we use on green roofs is really inert and low in nutrients. That there's a couple of reasons for which we do that. One of them is because it resembles the kind of xeric, like desert-like conditions which favor the species that we generally plant on green roofs, which are usually sedum, so like those succulent, really stress-tolerant species. But it also limits spontaneous colonization because people generally don't like weeds or don't want them on their green roof. However, in a study that I recently conducted, where I looked at how sedum cover or cover of a slow species and water availability affect the community structure and the traits of a colonizing community. So basically, I got these modules, filled them with green roof substrate, um, planted out sedum in the modules at different cover rates from 0 to 100% cover, and then gave them either a well watered or a water deficit irrigation treatment. Then I got 14 species, common spontaneous species, the seed of 14 species, and I made seed mixes that were balanced by the germination rate of each species. So they each had essentially an even chance of success in the modules. Um, and then I sowed these seed into the modules and basically looked at what emerged and looked at the
really,
abundance, the functional richness of these species and their traits. And essentially, what I found is that when you have an increased rate of sedum, you get the dominance of one species, and it was, you guessed it, a nitrogen fixing, spreading herbaceous species, and that's because the substrate is low in nutrients, so it gives it that competitive advantage. But it's also because of this cool thing called limiting similarity, where if you have an ecosystem, so you have this fast slow spectrum, we'll put it back into the fast slow spectrum because that's a simple way to understand it.
yeah.
The slow end of that spectrum is occupied by the sedum because it's a slow species, and that leaves this fast end open. And so when you supply a limiting resource like water, when you give it a lot of water, you have a lot of water that's not being utilized by the sedum because it's slow growing. It only needs a really small amount. And so you get a species like this nitrogen fixer that is functionally distinct. So it's very different to the sedum, and it can utilize a resources pool that the sedum doesn't really utilize, and so therefore it has this really big competitive advantage. And so yeah, we do find on green roofs broadly that those nitrogen fixing species do really well. But yeah,
And
I
then
guess that's
after
just
a
another.
period of time, do other ones start emerging or?
Indeed, they do.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that the general trend based on long-term studies is that initially you have a burst of these fast species, just like we were talking about in these newly demolished or these fresh terrain varg landscapes. However, eventually over time, that tends towards slower communities. And so after, for example, there's one study that went for 30 years on a green roof in Germany that
Oh,
showed that gradual change to a slower community. And that's because resources in the substrate change over time and are reduced over time. Um, and that results in a sort of competitive adaptive advantage if you're a slower growing species that doesn't really need huge amounts of resources to do well.
okay. How long would your experiments go for? Would they?
My experiments are all really quick because a PhD doesn't really go for too long.
Yeah.
So that experiment that I was just talking about, that went for 8 months. So that's based on
Okay.
a single colonization event, essentially on, like a newer green roof. But it's it's kind of interesting that the narrative of that, it's sort of for plant ecologists, but also green roof practitioners. Um, and it's most green roof practitioners are interested in how to limit spontaneous colonization. Um, but based on other work that I've done, that shows that these species are actually functionally great for green roofs. They meet all of these criteria that,
Yeah.
when we say this is a good functional green roof, spontaneous species just meet all of those, and they do really well, and they do it without needing maintenance,
Mm.
and they do it for basically no cost.
Yeah.
Um,
So
so
just the initial setup, and then you sort of have it there, and it will keep sort of changing over time.
yeah, and these spontaneous species will colonize and exist on green roofs that have very shallow substrates, and they regenerate from seed. So there's really the only maintenance that you would have to do is a yearly check to make sure that there's no trees, there's no figs or anything like that where their root systems might damage the waterproof
Oh, okay.
membrane on a rooftop.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah.
Oh, that's cool. So what? Yeah. What would be the human element in urban ecology? You sort of touched on disturbance regimes, but
Mhm.
what are the problems and solutions that we bring to these sort of spaces?
I guess the obvious thing is that urban landscapes are human designed, um, and they generally the urban environment is hotter, it's drier. There are more soil nutrients. There's increased light levels, and of course air pollution, and so these effects act as, I think I mentioned it earlier, I didn't go into too much detail, as like a habitat filter. And essentially they filter the species composition. Um, and actually, I have a slide here, which I will share,
Ah,
that
okay.
might make this a little bit easier.
Cool.
Um, so this is actually some work that my PhD supervisor, Professor Nick Williams, and some
Oh,
colleagues at that ARC did,
yeah.
looking at urban biodiversity filters. And so these things operate simultaneously to determine the success of species, the occurrence of species in cities. And they consist of habitat transformation, habitat fragmentation, the urban environment effect itself, and then human preferences. So I guess human preferences really goes to that point of, what sort of really direct, obvious impacts do we have? Um,
I,
but each one of these is really important. So you have habitat transformation, which adds species by creating novel habitats,
I,
and removes species from loss of native vegetation. Fragmentation removes species that are unable to persist in small and isolated areas, and the urban environment filter relates to these kind of, they're common factors globally in cities globally,
mm,
such as high population densities, increase impervious surfaces, so we replace soil with things like cement that are impervious to water, which changes the hydrology of urban environments. um, you have elevated pollution and elevated temperatures. So regarding human preferences, though, which I think is pretty interesting element. So research suggests that we tend to like plants that have large flowers, which I think that's common to just about everyone. I don't know anyone who doesn't like big flowers. Um,
that's why we
um,
also love dandelions, even if they're weird.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I mean that wind dispersal too. That's a
Mm,
pretty classic thing. Um, we also like flowers that are plants that fruit, especially if the fruit's edible, and that have broad leaves. We like broad leaf things. Um, we also like species that are edible for obvious reasons, that have nice foliage color. And certainly in Australian cities, particularly in Australian cities, we tend to prefer native species. And these preferences are actually really quite complicated, and they vary with income, with things like education level, and cultural background. But
yeah.
overall, these filters um, essentially, I think worldwide, cities account for about 5% of the world's plant species, but the data is very messy. And yet it does suggest that urbanization selects for really quite a small suite of species.
Mm,
Um, for example, it typically selects species that are adapted to alkaline environments, like I mentioned with the lime in cement. Urban soils are typically pretty um, high alkaline. Um, they're also species that prefer high nutrient environments and warmer habitats. So you have that increase in urban temperature, and species with fast annual life cycles at an advantage alongside trees. And the trees thing that more likely relates to that human preference. We do love canopy cover, and we understand that trees have a really significant cooling effect. Um,
mm,
so there is a typical cosmopolitan community of plant species that occur in more than according to research done by Mila Aronson and some colleagues, that there's this typical suite of species that occur in 90% of I think they surveyed 110 cities globally.
okay.
Um, and these are, yeah, usually annuals or biennials, so they have a short life cycle, and they respond well to disturbance.
Yeah.
And yeah, they're those fast-growing species that produce a lot of seed and then avoid disturbance through seed dormancy. So you can see how these spontaneous species really do relate to human behavior.
Yeah. And also just the way councils approach things, they kind of want to have native species, but they may not be very good for biodiversity. Whereas like
Mm.
they intentionally plant these sort of native plants because that's like grevilleas, and but then you might have an abandoned spot nearby and these other plants are really what's thriving in those kind of environments.
Yeah, I think
So
it's
we sort of need to change some sort of attitude or towards
yeah.
these kind of plants,
I think
especially in
I
drought affected
yeah.
areas. Or
Yeah, there has to be. some acknowledgement that what generally what councils are trying to do is facilitate native biodiversity, and it's not necessary. It's not that's not like biodiversity. That's a specific subset of species and the diversity of those species specifically. So it's
Mm.
native biodiversity. Um,
But it may not create a biodiverse
yeah, I think that's the issue
community.
in cities is because
Yeah.
they're so highly modified. The soils are completely different to what
Mm.
existed there beforehand. I mean, you look at the Yarra River, and there used to be a waterfall near Flinders Street Station that
Oh,
was
yeah.
that was blown up so we could turn ships around, and also to mitigate some of the flooding issues in the CBD. So now the Yarra is saline up until Dights Falls, and
Oh,
so
yeah.
the native vegetation that's growing on the banks of the Yarra, it's really suffering because of that. So
Mm.
it's the banks of the Yarra up to Dights Falls. The native indigenous vegetation that occurred there prior to 1778 is no longer really suited to those conditions. So there has to, it's this unfortunate series of events has kind of resulted in this situation where we have to consider what we plant in these landscapes,
Mm.
based on the conditions that prevail now, um, not prior to European invasion and colonization.
But at what cost in terms of like herbicides that we're putting so you stop the weeds, or it just feels like there's so much human intervention involved to recreate something that was, but can we ever really recreate that anyway?
I
Um,
think if you our species has been gardening for tens of thousands of years.
mm,
Like uh, there's evidence of the entire continent of Australia essentially being one massive garden that was managed in a very specific way to achieve very specific outcomes. I think that using herbicides and mowing and doing all the things that we do to create these sort of visions of landscapes that we have
mm,
it's essentially a similar thing. It's gardening, um, with issues like climate change and with some of the issues that we're seeing in cities, the urban heat island effect.
yeah.
That cities are generally becoming hotter, less hospitable places for people to live. Perhaps it is an opportunity for us to consider, yeah, how we manage these landscapes, how much energy we put into managing these landscapes, and what sort of outcomes that management is having. And then perhaps you can be critical or more critical of some of the approaches that councils have with using herbicides or removing specific species or get trying to return the landscape
Mm.
to like a historical analog. um, you can sort of be critical of that in considering what we should be focusing our effort on. I think personally, I feel like we should be focusing more of our effort on intact natural ecosystems that exist outside of the city.
And
Um,
preserving those, yeah,
yeah, and perhaps being a little more flexible with what
embracing
what
that
grows. Yeah,
novel kind of ecosystem in the city.
I
Like,
mean that's the thing, is that Melbourne is a city. We know that it's a city. It looks like a city. It behaves like a city.
yeah.
And these spontaneous species are essentially native to cities.
Mm.
So, and that's why they're so successful.
Yeah.
It's because they've evolved traits, or their traits have been selected by that urban environmental filter, that urban habitat filter. And so, yeah, perhaps it is an opportunity to assess the potential trade-offs You know, what sort of functionality are they providing us in terms of habitat creation, biodiversity, you know, the more specific things like stormwater mitigation on a green roof or cooling
Yeah.
from evapotranspiration on a green roof, and then making a more informed decision about how we manage them, rather than relying on what is predominantly, you know, like an emotional kind of cultural driven
Like
thing.
for these, or hatred for these species of plants,
Yeah,
native plants.
yeah, and that's a really
What
that's
will
another
engage
really
both?
complicated thing.
Yeah.
Mm.
Particularly through the pandemic, urban parkland has been so important for people to get in touch with nature. Where has been your favourite places to explore? We were kind of locked down and
Yeah,
we had
yeah,
much
and
choice of where we could go.
I know having that distance restriction was kind of a blessing and a curse in a way, because I really got to know, you know, the 5 kilometer radius, and then perhaps a little bit further than that. But we don't have to talk about that now. I'm sure
Yeah.
Daddy Dan may have been monitoring my Strava and seeing me leave the
Oh.
permissible zone.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so I think I really like some of the industrial areas along Darebin Creek.
Yep.
Um, of course, you know, being in that restricted zone, I began to venture off the trail,
Yep.
and look at some of the more, I guess you would call, like single track trails. And yeah, so I found quite a few cool industrial areas that have been essentially abandoned likely due to contamination. Um,
Oh, yeah.
and yeah, I think there's a few places along Darebin Creek and also along the Yarra River.
Oh, yeah.
As you head further north, there's offshoot trails that you can follow.
Oh.
Um, So yeah, I think those are probably my favorite spaces. This one here, down on the right here,
Ah.
this is all along Mary Creek,
Oh, cool.
up near Faulkner.
Yep.
Which Mary Creek's actually a really interesting place because it's kind of a gradient of ecological novelty. And so
Ah,
you have up and around Faulkner these landscapes that are, you know, really classic spontaneous landscapes. And so have
yeah.
really
That
good,
industrial kind of
yeah, and
semi-landed places.
it's industrial. It's like a history of, like, I think this area here was a dump at one point, and
Oh,
you can
yeah.
see this kind of dead car
Oh,
here and all this
yeah.
brick and stuff. It's because the Mary Creek um, has been eroding this side of the bank, and it's sort of revealing this old dump essentially. Um, so yeah, you've got this kind of history there, but it's an interesting combination of spontaneous species, but also native species.
Yeah.
And then as you head further south, like towards the city, you get to that Coburg Lake area,
Oh, yeah.
which is a really European landscape,
Yeah.
a lot of European species. And then as you travel further south towards Brunswick East, you find
Series they've
the
been trying to kind of regenerate that for the last 30 years or something.
Yeah, so I mean, Ceres is, if you look at some of the old pictures of that landscape, like Ceres is just a wonderful place. It
Mm.
really and Mary Creek generally, you know, the revegetation in Brunswick East there, what compared to what that creek looked like 30 years ago, it's just a
Yeah.
amazing transformation. Um, but yeah, you get that kind of really cool gradient. And I think that if there's anyone out there listening that's interested in ecology or wants to pursue research in ecology, that would be a great PhD project. Would be to look at
Yeah.
the functionality um, along that gradient.
Oh, that's great. Um, yeah, I was wondering, what is the intersection between art and science? My work looks at the diversity of plants in urban nature park left overgrow with taxonomy and colour fields constructed from colour in the immediate environment. How do you interpret what I'm doing from a scientific perspective?
So I think that fundamentally, art and science are both human attempts to comprehend and to understand and explain the world around us. We both work through exploration and experimentation. Science has a more traditional mode of communicating and sharing findings, and we tend to follow a really regimented, well-defined, linear method of inquisition. The underlying principle of which is repeatability. So that if you conduct an experiment, like the experiments that I've done, I sort of communicate my findings, but also provide a very succinct and focused methods section so that somebody else can repeat that experiment and hopefully find the same results. Artists, I guess, less driven by a less linear exploration of ego and culture and the kind of contradictions around that. But I also see artists increasingly incorporating more data-heavy and scientific modes of inquisition. I think what I got from your work, my interpretation of it, which I don't know if this is right or wrong, but I interpreted it as being a way to kind of disconnect these spontaneous species from that cultural association. So for me it was about these species are just colors. They're just like you could derive colors from these species, much like you can derive colors from from native species, from something that we would perhaps prefer in our gardens. So at the end of the day, they're just plants. They're not something to be feared or to be disliked. So that's kind of what I got out of it, and I think it's a very potent way of kind of communicating that idea. So I don't know if that's right or wrong. Perhaps you can tell me what you were trying to achieve.
Yeah, I guess I was trying to look at perception, I suppose, as well, and how we can look at an environment in a different way by using the colour fields, I suppose, as a way to get people to do a double take on that environment.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then you might look into those mixture of species more and look how different the greens are from that grass and to the native vegetation, but somehow they're coexisting, is what I found pipe makers to be really unique. And I found it quite a biodiverse place with all pardalotes and rare birds, and because there was less disturbance regime possibly in certain pockets. There was sort of interesting things going on there that, the council try to come in and regenerate certain areas or mow the weeds around the periphery, but then it just sort of overgrows again and the cycle continues, sort of thing. So it was kind of a unique place for me. I guess that's where I would go in the lockdowns, and that's how I started making this artwork, I suppose, during that period. And opened up to this whole area of study that I find really fascinating. I'm not sure if you have those slides that you did with those experiments.
I do.
Oh, you do? Cool.
I do. So I guess as a way to look at how so I had my interpretation of your work, and I wanted to see whether I could communicate the same concept, but using a scientific approach.
Yeah.
And so I did some image analysis, where essentially I took your images and represented them in an RGB color model using a process which is called image segmentation. So essentially, each of the pixels in your images were associated with a triple of a 3-channel value: red, green, and blue. Each pixel in the image has an intensity value, and these are rendered and combined to yield a specific color value. And so the process of segmentation essentially picks out all of the solid color regions in the original image and discards much of the finer details, so like the shape and the texture of things. There's many approaches can be taken to image segmentation, but in this case, I've taken what's called a k-means approach, and so this is the k-means algorithm. It partitions the image into clusters, and so by clustering these RGB values for each pixel, you get RGB values that are relatively close to each other. And so what I did was I broke the images down into 4 color regions, because after seeing your images, I thought that 4 was kind of approximately what you had done with the colors in some of the images. It's not true for all of the images that you have.
Yeah.
So then I represented these clusters in a 3-dimensional space by conducting what's called a principal components analysis. And that analysis essentially transforms the original RGB coordinate system into a new coordinate system, and this captures as much of the variance of the original data as possible. So up top you see this is the color space projection for the original image here, whereas below you can see that this is for the segmented image. And so this, from my perspective, is a kind of like a subjective interpretation of the color values in the images. And you can see how these sort of relate to the different regions, and I guess, the most common pixel values.
Yeah.
Here's another one.
Oh, different greens.
Yep. And so, yeah, I think this is kind of more subjective, but it's not purely subjective, because, like I said, I did choose those 4 regions to select, because I think it reflects your process. But I wasn't there when you captured these images. That's another added layer of data that I don't have. So I'm kind of relying on the sensor in the camera that you use to capture the images. And also, there's probably additional changes to the images that occurred when you send them to me, as they've been compressed or changed in whatever way. So the scientific process is only as good as the data that it's kind of analyzing in the first place. And I think this is very evident in this particular photograph. So obviously in the image, I think for me personally, I'm drawn to the yellow. And it's because it's striking in what is otherwise, like a kind of dull setting here. So this image analysis overlooks the color, because comparatively the yellow is actually quite rare in the image. So this process doesn't account for that color theory, so that more subjective, how do we feel about colors, how do we interpret colors? You have that social and cultural cues that kind of guide our focus and interpretation of the image. And so what I did was I added more means here, mean values, and you can see that the yellow does begin to appear as you analyze more of these kind of k-means clusters. But yeah, overall, I think that perhaps this does kind of achieve that same, communicate that same principle, that this terrain vague and spontaneous species are just simply ecology. There's the and we can manage these spaces in probably a better way than we are currently. We can garden them to suit our preferences, but I think we need to do this with an awareness of the value and the functionality of these species, and with an awareness of our own social and cultural biases. Why we feel a certain way about these plants. We really need to question that. And only then I think we can make a really truly informed decision about how we move forward.
Definitely. Oh, thank you so much for that, Dean. That was so informative.
My pleasure. It's cool. It's good to actually be able to kind of talk about this stuff. It's rare that you get a forum that isn't a kind of dry scientific conference, where you can sort of explore these ideas a little bit more. So yeah, I appreciate that.
Oh, great. Yeah, because it encompasses so many things of, history, geography. I'm drawn to all aspects, I suppose. And I think it was really fantastic meeting you, that you were so interested in that as well, beyond the scientific data,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I admit it has
we
been.
speak the same language, but in a different way. But
Yeah.
I really like that,
Yeah, it's been difficult to draw a line, because the research that I'm doing is what you might call pure science. It's this sort of objective look at the traits of these species and how they relate to environmental change. Um, Whereas I think probably for me personally, the most interesting part of this has been looking at the kind of philosophy and why we feel a certain way about these species, and particularly terrain vague as a concept itself.
Yeah.
These spaces that kind of exist in cities, but they don't exist within those kind of conventional in urban institutions. Like if
They're
people.
overlooked and marginalized, and I guess
Exactly.
I've always had an interest in these sort of areas, and now learning more deeply about the plants in those areas has given a whole different dimension to them now.
Yeah.
Just industrial aesthetics.
Yeah, but it's interesting too that something that I find a difficult thing to grapple with is that, when you begin to notice these spaces and begin to talk about protecting them, or, valuing them in a different way, they kind of cease to be terrain vague at that point. And so a really good example of that is there's the Naturpark Sugdeland, which is a park in Berlin that basically after the Second World War, it was kind of cut off by the wall. It was part of rail infrastructure, and it was a place that plants colonized and grew, and succession was able to occur, and it became really quite a biodiverse landscape. And so I think maybe 2 decades ago, Deutsche Bahn, which is the kind of German rail industry thing, they wanted to develop the site, but a community group who, people had been really enjoying this space for a long period of time. So it's a community group who advocated for it to be protected, and eventually Deutsche Bahn actually donated the land to the German government, as an offset for other developments that they were doing. They didn't just give it up for nothing, but it then became a place of intense ecological study by people like Ingo Kovarik, who documented the species on that site. And he found that it was gradually being overtaken by trees and eventually would just become a sort of forested landscape. But there were areas there, little patches of grassland that had really high species and functional diversity and actually had a lot of very rare species growing. And so when this what originally would be termed a terrain vague landscape, when it was protected, um, there were decisions based on, I guess, the kind of opinions, but also the science. But it was really an ecologist-driven decision to maintain these grassland areas because of their uniqueness and their novelty. And so you kind of see it's actually a very heavily managed landscape now. It's fenced off. You pay a euro entry, and that kind of pays for the maintenance. But yeah, it's no longer terrain vague. It's almost like a kind of museum exhibit or like a zoo or something like that. It's like, this is what terrain vague looks like. And I mean, it is a beautiful park. I absolutely
And you've
love
been
it.
there, haven't you?
I have. Yeah, I was there just before the pandemic.
Lucky you.
And it's wonderful. And it it's interesting in Berlin. These spaces are very highly valued, and urban nature and wild urban landscapes are really highly valued. And I do wonder if eventually a similar thing will occur here, but only time will tell.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll end it on that note.
Sure.
But I think the more we talk about these sort of issues, and maybe people might start thinking differently about them.
Perhaps, yeah. Well, I think it's been interesting to see the interest from artists in these landscapes. Like I've noted that you've had plant walks, and there does seem to be this, and I think that's the key. Like artists are really at the coal face of making these changes in society. In investigating these concepts that to many people might seem pretty wild and out there.
Yeah.
So,
but it's getting people to spot something in the cracks, or people start looking more closely. I guess is what the walk demonstrated. Actually,
yeah,
people really got curious and were really interested, in particular things. So
yeah,
that's what's exciting, and I think we'd like to do more of those. So maybe that's something you might want to do too.
yeah. Well, once I've submitted this thesis, I'll probably have a little more time to do things like that. That would be cool because I'm kind of relying on you guys to get the message out there.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for your time. It's been fantastic to do this with you, and I'm so glad I met you.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Appreciate it, and congratulations on the exhibition and the work.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
We're just going to put up a list of links that we put together. If that's okay. Just so people can find some resources in this area. I've been really interested in Matthew Gandhi. I guess we had a great exchange of essays that we were sharing with each other. Oh, don't worry. Yeah, we're just waiting for a bit of technical stuff, but even just reading, the terrain vague and how that was related to architecture and photography was really interesting. And yeah, so there's just a few different things people can look up if they like.
Yeah, it is. It's really fascinating the influence that photography has had on our perception of cities and how they should look and how they should function. Um, some of this, I think, some of the stuff, the research papers that I've put there will be behind paywalls,
Oh, yeah.
but there are some sneaky ways around that. Um, maybe maybe we can share a link to some of those
Yeah, or Z
sneaky ways.
libraries. That's been very amazing. I think
Oh
amazing
yeah,
resource when you're not at uni. So
yeah,
you can find a lot of this stuff, and even ResearchGate you can join for free. I've found great.
yeah. And sometimes there are full
They
texts.
allow it. Yeah,
Yeah, yep.
is good.
Yeah, I think I always try to publish my work as you know, to be available to everyone.
Yeah,
But it's really quite expensive to do that.
oh, okay.
So it's usually two or
You
three
have to,
thousand dollars to
really?
publish something open access. Yeah,
You have to pay that. Okay.
yeah. But that's changing. That is also changing. There's more of a push
That's
towards
important.
open access.
All right. Well,